What's going on, buddies? Will Sherland again with Gutter Fighting Secrets. Today what we're going to be looking at is an interesting topic indeed. The history of the Assassins, or Hashshashin. So this is going to be a very brief overview. I'm going to leave a lot of information out, and I'm only going to hit you guys with the pertinent and relevant information here. So I got a message from Mad Jack after I deployed the Samurai History video asking me to look into the history of the Assassins and what we might be able to gain from their martial prowess. And here we go. Boom. New martial history video. Quick legal disclaimer before we get started. I'm going to be utilizing the Fair Use Act potentially here. I'm not charging for this information, and in good faith, I believe everything that we do utilize as far as media resources goes falls under the Fair Use Act. Now, with all that legal disclaimer BS out of the way, let's just dive right into it and find out who were the Assassins. So it all started with this fella, Hassan Sabah, leader and founder of the Hashshashin organization. Hassan Sabah was born in 1050 AD in the city of Qom in modern-day Iran, which is one of the holiest cities even to this very day in Shia Islam. Now, without going into all of the history of it and all of the boring details, basically this all kind of stems from the beef between Shia and Sunni Islam. Now, what is the difference? This is something that a lot of us, especially here stateside and in Europe, don't really understand too well. Basically, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there were two challengers for the succession of Caliph or leader of Islam, and one of them, Abu Bakr, was the advisor of the Prophet, and the other one, Ali, was the Prophet's cousin. And Shia Islam believes that it should be the direct descendant of the Prophet that inherits the leadership position, and Sunni believe that it should be earned, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the direct descendant. That's a very brief, in a nutshell, description of kind of what the beef is. It's a political thing from what I understand. I'm no expert, but that's the basics. And obviously there's a whole lot of history that comes after that, violence back and forth. Nothing like this is ever simple. However, that's basically where it started. So obviously, being born here in Persia or modern-day Iran, Hassan would have been a Shia dude. And a lot of these Sunni bros were definitely trying to get the better of these guys. It went back and forth. But that's kind of where this all came from, was the need from the Shia Muslims to incur military campaigns against the Sunni Muslims. Now, there is a lot of back and forth between different sects and tribes and parties that Hassan had belonged to and the ins and outs of all that, but I'm going to leave all that out. If you want to learn more about the true history of this gentleman, then I would recommend checking out this video, Hassan Sabah, Legend of the Assassins, by Biographics. Anyway, Hassan eventually came to power within his tribe or sect or whatever you call it, and decided that he needed to undertake basically a guerrilla campaign against his enemies. So what did he do? It was actually quite genius. He really rapidly occupied a series of high grounds and built impregnable fortresses on them, and launched a campaign of targeted assassinations and killings against high-ranking officials and opposing leaders. Now, once he had gone ahead and started doing this, he rapidly started making alliances with other leaders and being very diplomatic, and also converting and acquiring and recruiting existing soldiers and officers. He also maintained a vast library of texts and scientific instruments and things of that nature. He was a very learned and astute man. Now, if you look at the way he was doing this, it's actually quite interesting. It really kind of parallels the way that the U.S. went into Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East and started operating. He would basically take over existing fortresses and improve them, improve the irrigation systems, improve the living conditions for the people and whatnot. And he would basically win the hearts and minds of the people and the soldiers and officers and whatnot and bring them over to his side by very practical and diplomatic means. So anyways, there were some back and forth skirmishes and battles and whatnot. Eventually, Hassan basically started going to work with these targeted killings. He would take his most faithful soldiers, order them to basically go on a suicide mission, which they accepted serenely, and went ahead and, through various covert means and methods and tactics, targeted, surveilled, and eventually killed about 75 leaders and high-ranking officials from the opposing forces. Now, these opposing forces would definitely run a smear campaign against the soldiers of Hassan and Hassan himself, painting them as terrorists and drug addicts. This is where the term Hashshashin came into play originally. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story. However, some of you who are not, the term Hashshashin came from the fact that supposedly these assassins were high on hashish, weed, pot, Mary Jane, reefer, bud, freaking tree. And if you actually look in Afghanistan today, a lot of the Taliban and even some of the ANF, the Afghani National Army, Afghani National Forces soldiers would, they love to smoke weed before battle, during a battle sometimes, after a battle, just, they like to get high. And actually, in the Middle East, even though Islam forbids it, it's a really kind of a thing, especially in different regions, to smoke hash. It's just like what they do. It's kind of a pastime. Just like here in the States, however, our soldiers aren't really running around smoking it, at all, really. But the question remains, were these assassins actually smoking hash to get themselves in the mind state before freaking going and doing these missions? Well, the reality of it apparently is no. They generally were not. They were generally not smoking hash and then going and doing these, high-profile targeted assassinations. They wouldn't. It would just not make any sense to go smoke hash and then try to, do these clandestine missions. They were elite soldiers and well-trained, well-disciplined, and quite religious. So, did they smoke hash? I don't know. But they certainly did not do it in the way that we were all taught in that urban legend. They simply were given that name kind of as a smear. And that kind of stuck and has gone down as the urban myth, urban legend of the Hashshashin, or Hashmen. However, it is interesting to note that when prospective young men were brought to Hassan, what he would do was drug them with opium. Now, before I go into that, it's important to note that Hassan, in his main fortress, had the largest freaking garden in the whole world. Like the largest, the most beautiful garden with like 3 canals, one for irrigation, one for making wine, and one for, I think, drinking. And it was just like this beautiful, huge, large garden with beautiful people in it. He would fill it with like beautiful young women, beautiful people, kind of the best of the best. And he would take these young men in there and wake them up briefly after they had been drugged with the opium, and they would look around and see this beautiful garden with these beautiful people, and everything was so amazing. And then they would pass back out, and when they woke up, he would return them to like normal life. And he wouldn't tell them that they were drugged by opium, but he would basically manipulate their heads to think, hey, I had a vision of heaven, and the only way to get back to that, back to that paradise, back to that heaven, is to die in the service of this assassin cult, and then I can go back to that paradise. So it was brainwashing and manipulation purely. I don't know, maybe that sounds kind of familiar to you guys. But anyway, he did use opium as a drug to kind of start to manipulate and brainwash these young assassins before bringing them into the order. Which actually that brings us directly into the methods, tactics, and training of these assassins. So I mentioned that he would drug them, wake them back up in the garden, and then wake them back up in normal life. That's one story. The other story is simply that he would bring them into these beautiful gardens, give them wine and beautiful young ladies and all of these things, and basically tell them, hey, this is what heaven is like. This is what paradise awaits you after you die, so that they would not be afraid of death. Because when these young men would go out on their assassinations, it wasn't really at all like popular myth has you believe, where they were sneaking into fortresses and swinging all over the place and battling like hundreds of guards. It was more like they would go and have the introduction be introduced to a leader and spend potentially years getting to know this guy, getting close with him, gaining rapport and trust. That way, when the time was finally there and the ability to get alone with him or bypass his bodyguard and his security measures was right, then he could take a dagger and assassinate the individual. However, generally speaking, escape wasn't really a thing. There was no exfiltration plan. It was generally accepted that he would be discovered and promptly killed or executed. They really were suicide attackers. Now, that's not to say that they never were able to exfil. I'm sure sometimes they were. However, the majority of the time, it probably wasn't really an option. Also, this is one of the ways that they appeared so mysterious. You never knew who it was going to be. Who was the guy that was actually the assassin? I'm sure in many cases it seemed like they appeared out of nowhere. However, the reality of this type of operation is, generally, 9 times out of 10, the majority of the operation has more to do with social skills, cunning, and manipulation than military tactics whatsoever. The majority of this type of work, clandestine operations or spycraft or whatever, really doesn't have much lurking around in the shadows in the dark of night and climbing up enemy fortress walls at all. Generally, it's a stagnant job, at least physically speaking, with no need generally for hand-to-hand combatives or expert marksmanship and all of that. More of a need for social ability, the ability to lie, the ability to deceive, the ability to manipulate, all of that real tradecraft type of stuff. That is what these individuals would have been utilizing mostly. That, along with at times disguise and clever backstories. So doing surveillance and intelligence gathering would be really a paramount thing in these guys' operational capabilities or operational training. So what was their training actually like? Like, what was the meat and potatoes of what they would have been learning? Well, it started off apparently with a lot of hand-to-hand combatives. Now, the hand-to-hand combat that these guys would have been learning would be highly effective and straight-to-the-point stuff, much like I show on my channel. All of the good shit, none of the bullshit. But the thing is, they really train these guys well in hand-to-hand combat. I said that there wasn't much of a need for hand-to-hand combat. However, when you're dealing with being a lone operator somewhere, you want to know it and know it well. It's better not to need it and to know it than to not know it and need it. Now, another thing that they would have been highly trained in is knife fighting. Now, when I say knife fighting, you always get the picture of like Daniel Boone with his Bowie knife or whatever, freaking fighting a guy head-to-head with 2 knives, right? Like 2 guys dueling it out with a knife. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about learning vital areas of the body, where the organs are located, what the best places to stab and cut, how to go ahead and do that. They would have probably trained patterns very heavily and ingrained it into their muscle memory, but more so learning anatomy and where to cut and how to cut or stab would be kind of what they were training. And they were, from what I understand, highly trained in exactly that, for the specific reason that that's exactly how the assassins would kill, for a very specific reason. Obviously, they could poison the individual. However, the individual could acquire an antidote and recover from the poisoning, or the poison could be ineffective in some way. They could try to shoot him from a distance with an arrow, but that arrow might miss the vital area. The victim could survive. The target could survive. The one surefire way to make sure that the target was neutralized was to get up close to him and stab him to death in the vital areas numerous times until you were sure, you saw with your eyes, that the individual was dead and neutralized once and for all, not coming back anymore to carry on any of his silly freaking escapades. Once the assassin acquired his target and started going to work, there was no coming back. That's how they wanted it. Thusly, being skilled in hand-to-hand combatives along with knife skills, they would be a deadly force when they finally did come up against their target. Even if the target tried to fight back or whatever, they would be able to overcome and dominate the situation and take care of business. So you see in like the modern video game, Assassin's Creed, that he's freaking Superman running around and is like highly trained in combatives and just fucking up all the soldiers and bodyguards everywhere. Well, no, that's not exactly how it went. He wouldn't try to fight the bodyguards, but he would need to know hand-to-hand combatives well in order to take out the target. And just in case any opposition was met along the way, he would be capable enough to neutralize that as well. Now, along with hand-to-hand combatives and learning vital areas and how to strike them would be a lot of spycraft. Obviously, we had talked about how it was important to go ahead and, just like today, it is important to go ahead and surveil your target before you strike. That's why on this channel we talk a lot about knowing your surroundings and being able to understand if you are potentially being targeted or surveilled, and the importance of understanding that to make yourself more of a hardened target. And that's exactly how these assassins back then, just like today, would have operated. They would have spent a long time gathering the information on the subject's routine and the subject's lifestyle, and when would be the most opportune times to strike. So knowing all of that and how to go about doing all of that and run the surveillance cycle, run the intelligence gathering cycle, and all of that stuff would have been part, I'm sure, of the training that these guys received. Now, as you can see here, this is a basic target selection cycle or surveillance cycle. It starts with selecting your target, then planning, then the deployment of the activity, the attack, and then the escape and exploitation. Now, the escape and to some degree the exploitation were not necessarily part of this. However, the exploitation to some degree also would have been. However, the escape, not so much. The target selection, obviously, who do we want to get? The planning, how are we going to get this done? The deployment, all right, it's time, let's do it. The attack, boom, assassination. The escape, let's get the freak out of there and exfiltrate. Then the exploitation being, hey, we killed this guy, look at us, fear us, we're freaking a force to be reckoned with, and, blah, blah, blah. Also, they like to exploit the fear both on the civilian population as well as the military brass or leadership that, hey, this could happen to us at any minute, maybe we better start to play ball with these guys. Now, speaking about how these guys would exploit the fear that they've created, after this string of assassinations, I mentioned that about 75 high-ranking officials were assassinated, 25 of them in a very short consecutive period. After that, there really was a lot of fear of these assassins, and it was said that a king, even though he might have 100,000 men, would still walk in fear of these guys, Hassan's guys. Now, it's important to note, and I said that a lot of the times these guys were on straight up suicide missions, and that wasn't always the truth. They varied their tactics quite a bit, so it wasn't always a suicide mission. Sometimes they did escape, and they were able to escape and then be used again in other missions. But the important part to note here is they were so effective because every time they would assassinate somebody, they would vary their tactics, even just slightly enough. It was never the same type of assassination every time. Everything was personalized and individualized from the information that they had collected doing their surveillance cycles. So another take on this terrorist cycle or typical way that we see these things go is very similar. It starts with target selection, surveillance, then planning, and in between planning and deployment there would be training or rehearsal. And a thing that made these guys so effective is that target selection would take place, then surveillance, then planning, and in between the planning and deployment section, they would rehearse the assassination for a while, a couple of months even, potentially. And we see modern terrorists do this as well. Even, our special forces do this quite effectively and quite often. In fact, in all of the training I have ever gone through, when we have done, a shoot house or a mock mission or anything, we have always rehearsed before we step off. It's just what you do. Now, what makes that different and this different in this type of deal isn't really that much. It's kind of just the specific training or rehearsal that they do. So, target selection, surveillance, planning, training, deployment, where they deploy to the AO and where they're going, and then attack. Then hopefully they escape. If not, they freaking die or get captured. And then finally exploitation. Even if the operative or operatives are dead or captured, higher up will still be able to exploit the fear that they've created, and inevitably bring some parties to a negotiation table that otherwise may not have, or something to that nature. So while I'm on the topic of the Hashshashin, I have to mention the connection between the Assassins and the Templars. What was the connection? Because popular culture has made it kind of an idea that these two factions or these two organizations were either enemies or in some way connected. But the answer is not really. In actuality, these two forces or factions kind of had a mutual respect for each other, but they didn't really interact too much. In fact, they really tried to avoid stepping on each other's toes, simply for the fact that they were both extremely powerful forces in the Middle East at the time. They were both special forces, and they were both highly motivated by a very religious and mystic ideology, which obviously makes them a very, very powerful force to be reckoned with. So neither one wanted any beef from the other. In fact, the Assassins were more interested in fighting other Muslim enemies rather than the Christians. There was one example when a fella named Count Raymond of Tripoli was assassinated, and we're still not sure if it was the Templars that did it or another Christian king that had it done, or if that Christian king had actually hired the assassin to do it for him. Maybe the Templars were utilizing him, or the assassin rather, but basically the long and short of it was this guy was going to become a powerful ruler, and a lot of different people didn't want it to happen, so this guy was assassinated. One of his assassins was captured and claimed to be working with the Assassins, but again, we're not sure if that was a false confession or what. Another example is when King Louis IX of France was visiting Acre in modern-day Israel. The Assassins requested, or demanded rather, protection money for his visit while he was there, so that nothing would happen to him, and they would promise not to assassinate him, and also promise to, kind of protect him. However, the Templars intervened, and the Grand Master of the Templars being a French organization, sat down with the envoy from the Assassins, negotiated, and basically sent him back empty-handed with a non-aggression pact being signed. Now that's kind of it for the connection between the Templars and the Assassin. By the way, I am going to be doing a martial history video on the Templars at some point, so stand by for that. But I did need to just mention that to clarify the history there, because again, you can see here the modern pop culture myths about the Assassins, and then the reality of it is two very different things. So what can we take away and learn from these ancient warriors, the Hashshashin of old? Well, there is a lot of lessons that we can take away from them here. The first lesson I'd like to talk about is occupying defendable ground. When you decide that it is time to bug out and take up arms against an opposing force, the important thing to do would be to find and occupy ground that is highly defendable, and non-permissive for the enemy or opposing force. The second thing that we want to look at here and be aware of, and we can take from Hassan's teachings, or actions rather, is launch targeted strikes from a safe place, from a safe distance. We want to utilize that defendable ground to launch strikes from that area. We are safe, our HQ, our higher up, our leadership is safe to go ahead and conduct all of the planning and all of the preparation, and from there the operatives will step off and launch those targeted strikes. Now, the third thing that I want to bring up here is diplomacy. It is extremely important to be diplomatic and constantly be making connections with other people, constantly making alliances, cementing those alliances, going ahead and winning hearts and minds of the people around you, not only of your allies, but also the general civilian population that's surrounding your area of occupation, your area of operation, and just in general, winning the hearts and minds of people so that they don't turn against you. You really want all of the support to be on your side, and none of the support, or very little of the support, to be on the side of the opposing or enemy force. You want the people in general to hate them and love you for what you were doing. You want to be looked at as a freedom fighter or someone who is defending them from an evil or opposing force. And this actually brings me into the fourth thing that we can take away here is winning people to your side by lack of civilian or collateral damage. You can utilize the acronym here, METTC, which for those of you who did not serve or haven't had any tactical training, METTC is an acronym that we utilize when we talk about this type of stuff: mission, enemy, terrain, time, and civilian considerations. We can pick this apart in a different video, but for this particular topic, I want to go into the civilian considerations. Hassan did not target large groups of crowds, large groups of people. He didn't do what the modern day terrorists do and indiscriminately just set off bombs or kill, large groups of people. He targeted specific leaders, specific heads of specific organizations. When he launched a strike, he killed that leader and that leader alone. He tried even to avoid killing any soldiers, killing any bodyguards. When he struck the one person. It was done, and that was it. There was no collateral damage whatsoever except for the operative. And actually, if you think about it, that operative kind of wanted to go to heaven anyway, so I guess it worked out for everybody involved, except the target. Now, another thing that we want to learn from these Hashshashin is gathering intelligence before conducting an operation. You really want to learn everything you possibly can about your target. And that's going to take a long time, potentially. It's not going to happen overnight. You have to be patient. But when you're gathering intelligence before conducting any operation, you have to be very, very thorough and very detailed. A lot of the times, these operations you'll come to see, it's way more time is spent on planning than actually the operation itself. You could plan for months, and then the operation could be over in a matter of 20 minutes. But it's because of all of the planning that went into it beforehand that operation took 20, 15, 10 minutes to complete, rather than turning into a big clusterfuck and this and that. Planning and gathering intelligence before conducting any operation is the most important part of it all. Now, another thing that we want to learn is varying our tactics and timing. I'll start with varying tactics. Obviously, these guys were so successful because they didn't do it the same way every time. Sometimes they would dress as a monk and do it that way. Sometimes they would dress as a Sufi mystic. Sometimes they would gain the guy's trust over years of time and do it that way. Sometimes there's stories of these guys actually infiltrating the close protection team of their target and doing it that way. So there was so many different ways that these guys went about doing it and getting the operation done. They were patient, they had gathered their intelligence, they used diplomacy to win people over to their side, and they were very good at what they did. So varying your tactics is a huge thing. You never want to do things the same way all the time so that your enemy force learns how you do it. Another thing is varying their timing. Again, like I said, they were patient. They went ahead and waited. They never had a strict timeline that they were working with. They did on a few occasions, but usually they were able to wait and get things done. Another thing about varying your timing, just for the opposite side of here, is when you are going about your daily routine. You'll hear this, I talk about this a lot, to avoid hostile surveillance or potentially hostile surveillance. Varying your timing is an important thing. So don't go to the Starbucks every day at 9 a.m. Sometimes go at 8:30. Sometimes go at 10. Sometimes don't go at all. So varying your time just to confuse people is kind of a very important thing to think about. That doesn't really apply here as much, but I did want to throw that in just for you guys, free bonus. Now, another thing, and the last thing I'm going to talk about here, is exploiting advantages that have been gained. If you'll notice, these guys took the advantage, and like I talked about in the surveillance cycle, you really want to exploit the fear that has been struck into the enemy force. You want to exploit the fear that even potentially is struck into the civilian force, but more so, you want to exploit every advantage that you have gained from these missions. Every single time that you have a success, you want to exploit it and milk it for all it's worth. That's a very important part about winning the war in the long term, is exploiting the advantages that have been taken. So listen guys, I'm going to wrap it up at this point. I appreciate you watching all the way through. As always, please remember that you are your first and last line of defense. Don't forget to go ahead, throw a thumbs up, like the damn video, click over wherever the hell it is and that notification thing, turn it on. If you haven't subscribed already, I would appreciate it if you would consider doing so. It helps me out, helps the channel out, tells YouTube to take me seriously. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and throw them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to request any videos that you would like to know any information about. I will do my best to satisfy your inquiries. So guys, until next time, please remember that you are your first and last line of defense, and I will see you on the next video. Cheers, mother flowers.